This is one of the tape recordings for the Centennial Library of Tape Recordings, done in the archives room on Tuesday, December 31st, 1968. The main purpose of this interview today is to talk with Mr. K. Berner Dahlen, especially about some of the work in connection with the coming election of Dr. Christensen to the presidency of Augsburg, and later to talk about the beginnings of student personnel work at Augsburg. Carl Chrislock and Mrs. Teresa Hanes and I, Gerda Mortensen, will be asking questions as the interview progresses.
And just to fill in a little of your biographical data, Berner, you graduated from Augsburg in 1931, is that right?
That's
and
right.
You were out teaching in the public schools for the next 10 years, with some graduate work interspersed.
Right.
And then you came to Augsburg in 41, was it?
In the fall of 41.
In the fall of 41. Well, the first thing I think we want to talk about here is the 1938 annual conference of the Lutheran Free Church. And is it correct that you were as secretary of committee number 2, the committee that was to respond to the reports of the educational institutions?
The committees of the church conference were elected or were nominated by the conference the year before and elected, so that actually we were members of the conference for a whole year beforehand. But our meeting began on Wednesday, the first step of which was to elect officers, and Reverend Arthur Henson was elected chairman, and I was elected secretary, a post which I accepted with some reluctance. That's particularly humorous because I'm a teacher of composition, but writing in such conditions is not the easiest thing for me to do. But from that time on, we met as a committee whenever possible during the conference and tried to put into a few pertinent paragraphs the report of the president of the Board of Trustees and other influential members of the Augsburg administration. Among other topics, of course, was the one of major importance, the nominating of a new president. And this we did, I remember particularly after the opening salutation, I had written a paragraph to the effect that we mourned the untimely death of the late George Sverdrup. And immediately Professor Andreas Helland raised a rather stern protest with the explanation to the congregation that in God's hands nothing is untimely. And so, of course, the congregation voted this out of the committee's report. Excuse me. I've since thought that this is a theological problem, and I wouldn't be in a position to argue it one way or the other. And of course, it really didn't figure here. But that's the one thing that I remember from reading the report. There was this one protest, and the rest of the report, it seems to me, was received by the conference with no disturbances of any kind. I remember once that Dr. Berntveit raised his eyebrows and stopped me from reading for a moment while he said, there's a considerable amount of noise in the church auditorium, and this is a Christian conference, or something to this effect, and that there ought not be this kind of a disturbance. And with that, of course, the disturbance quieted down, and I was permitted to continue my reading. Now, the reports, of course, were made first read all the way through, and then were followed through paragraph by paragraph. And after that initial plunge, I really have no recollection of any other no dissension, no disturbance of any kind, other than that you see, the secretary presented the paragraph to the conference and then stepped aside, and the president of the conference took over. So if there was any discussion, I really had no part in it, and I don't recall that there was any, except, as I have mentioned, the one about the reference to the untimely death of the late George Sverdrup.
Do you remember that Dr. Benton took the floor and made a very strong statement about the fact that they had agreed that the only candidate to be considered was Dr. Christensen, and that Dr. Norberg should not come under consideration? They had information that would mean that this would be punctum. This would be undesirable. He said it very carefully, but he said it with great firmness.
Yes, I remember that. It seemed to me that came, I don't remember if it was before the voting or after.
Before, I think.
Before the voting. But he did make a very emotional speech in which he kept his voice very low and very very well controlled, but certainly emotional filled. I think he said something to this effect, that we had hoped that this would not have to come before the conference, but that since there had been some pressure on the Board of Trustees, that he was forced to make that statement.
Now, just to refresh your memory a little here, the Board of Trustees of Augsburg brought, of course, to the conference the recommendation, or rather the nomination of Bernard Christensen as president of Augsburg. And this had been announced a little less than a month before the conference. The actual nomination had been made in March, but it was sat on for about 2 months. This was partly at least because Christensen wasn't yet ready to accept. And after the announcement was made, in the church papers, there was some objection to the fact that the Board of Trustees had nominated only a single candidate. There were some who expressed the view that the annual conference should have had 2 or more candidates. Now, I was wondering if within committee number 2 there was any argument in favor of 2 candidates, modifying the Board of Trustees' report to that extent.
The members of the committee, of course, were frequently cornered during the conference by certain representatives of the opposition who suggested that it's an undemocratic process not to have 2 candidates. And as I told my wife this morning, I was very young then. I was only 32. So I thought, too, that it would have been better if they had had 2 candidates at least to vote on for the conference. But since that time, I have served on many committees, and I think there are more frequently nominating committees who place in nomination 1 person rather than 2, and still it would be considered a democratic process. Now, if the conference had wanted to introduce a second candidate, this was entirely within the power of the conference. But as far as the committee is concerned, I remember distinctly that we had a fairly lengthy and perhaps somewhat heated discussion on this topic. The conference committee could only do with what they had received from the Board of Trustees. If the Board of Trustees presented us with 1 nomination for presidency, that's what we had to work with. And the idea of putting in a sticker candidate or someone else was contrary to the rules of work of the church. At least this is the stand that the committee took, and I was happy to have that to lean back on because, as you know, you do hear a few things here and there, and we had heard that the candidate that was being proposed was not the particular candidate that we would like to have as a longtime president of our institution. And so I personally had some leaning in the direction of the committee rather than in the direction of the opposition.
Didn't the Augsburg Corporation have a meeting and pass on the procedure? The Board of Trustees reported corporation passed on some of these things before the annual meeting.
Well, yeah, I can clarify that.
No, I was not.
No, that was long before the conference. You see, that corporation meeting. The Board of Trustees worked out sort of a 4-stage procedure. They were a little bit in doubt as to how to go about electing a president. It had it had been so informal in the previous cases. And so the first stage really was to have a preferential vote within the corporation. Now, I'm not sure that that preferential vote was ever made public. It's in the corporation minutes. There were 19 votes cast. Christensen got 8. Berntveit 4. Clarence Carlson 4. Norberg 2. And Hendrickson 1. And this then was disclosed to the Board of Trustees. This was back on March 9th and 10th. The Board of Trustees then unanimously nominated Christensen. And that was the second stage. Now the third stage, of course, was to be conference action on the board nomination. And the fourth stage would be the final stage, Board of Trustees ratification of the conference action, which was legally necessary. And the most controversial part of the whole thing, of course, was this business of only one candidate. And I guess my question, I guess you've answered my question. My question was whether within committee number 2 there was any agitation afoot to modify the Board of Trustees recommendation to the point of having 2 candidates. And you indicate that this wasn't possible under the operating rules.
Well, that's true. That's the attitude that the committee took. Now, as I recall it, we did receive a substitute paragraph written out by a member of the opposition that was suggested as a substitute, which we could insert into our committee report. And this did include the 2 candidates. Excuse me. But when we met in committee, we decided that as you know, the committees of the church were elected by, or were nominated by a committee the year before, and in the procedure, very frequently, people got on committees for which they had very little competence, and I don't know that any of us, perhaps Reverend Arthur Hansen was well qualified. I don't know who the other members of the committee were at this moment.
I have them here. It was Johannes Ringsted, and Ingvald Norum, and Joe Husflon, and yourself, and Arthur Hansen.
I suppose that each of us could say that we were fond of Augsburg and were good supporters of it, but as far as the inner workings of the Board of Trustees and the administration of the school, this would certainly be far removed from myself and I think other members of the committee. So when it came to ruling on which really the committee was being asked to do, to rule on that the fact that the Board of Trustees had not done adequately for the conference by presenting only one candidate, this would really put us in a position as a committee of overruling the Board of Trustees. And as I have mentioned before, I think that the rules of work were such that we had no authority to take anything outside of the material presented to us by the corporation and the Board of Trustees. And that's the stand that we took and on which we operated. And of course, I think I had a little glow of satisfaction when Dr. Berntveit made his announcement, because we felt a little harried by the members of the opposition who had gotten to us between committee sessions and tried to put some pressure on that we ought to do this and we ought to do that. In fact, on one occasion, the aisle was blocked through which I wanted to go, and I was detained for a minute or two, in which I was close enough to the people who were protesting that I felt really uncomfortable. Of course, I'm basically a peaceful man, and this was something quite strange and different for me. Now, in all deference to oppositions, it seems to me that, as I mentioned informally before, the enthusiasm with which the younger group from the college and from the church had greeted Dr. Norberg in his appearance in Minneapolis, I think is one indication as to why this enthusiasm tended to want to increase and retain such a man for our own institution. So I don't think that my own statements about them would be in any sense criticism, but simply a matter of stating the position of the committee of which I was a member.
Yeah. Now, I think a few days ago in a conversation, you indicated that there were some members of the Norberg faction who put pressure, or who, you mentioned that here too, that they put pressure on members of the committee. Now, did I understand that some of them tried to put pressure on you as secretary to turn in a report with 2 nominations?
Well, actually, the least that they thought that I could do, if I had any sense of citizenship at all, was to turn in a minority report. And this, I think, in all fairness, is possible, I believe. A member of a committee would have a complete authority to go against the motions of the committee majority and turn in a minority report. And it was felt, or it was so stated by members of the opposition, that this was my responsibility, moral responsibility, if not legal responsibility. And they would provide me with all the paragraphs necessary for this minority report. But of course I resisted that as strenuously as I could. And I was glad afterwards that I had done it because, among other things, as I mentioned to you privately, Carl, Dr. Berntveit waited for the committee, and when I came, he said, will the secretary please report for committee number 2? And I walked all the way down in front of the church, right down the middle of the aisle, and then he raised his eyebrows and said, who is going to read your report? Where's the secretary of the committee? And I said, I'm the secretary of the committee. So he stopped for a moment. Very few times that Dr. Berntveit was caught without some word to say. And I guess he didn't know what word he wanted to say at that particular point. I think he was impressed by the gravity of the situation, and here I was, a mere novice. My only position was that of an alumnus who had been nominated to the committee, and I think he was looking for some other person to present the report. We had, of course, urged the chairman of the committee read the report in the conference, but he refused to do it, since he said it was the routine for the secretary to read the report. Well, that was a humorous aside, I think.
Did President Berntveit have any suspicion because of your youth that you were a member of the other faction, you think?
I'd rather not mention that aspect of it. Dr. Berntveit and I had a number of interesting conversations, one of which was done in Norwegian. And So I have an opinion as to why he did it, but I'd rather not say.
Well, now I think we've established some of the main facts here. The opposition did want or did expect you to turn in a minority report, you say, and I've wondered about that, why a minority report was not turned in. That, of course, would indicate the committee number 2 on the whole was with the recommendation of the board, wouldn't it?
I think there's no question about the fact that the committee was fairly well unified on the topic of having just one candidate as presented by the Board of Trustees. I think we would have felt more comfortable if there had been another candidate presented. However, the committee certainly was in support of the candidate that was listed by the Board of Trustees. Now, as far as the minority report is concerned, perhaps that was because of the fact that the committee kept pressing us with the urgency of this, and I suppose it raised some stubbornness on the part of the committee in opposition to being pressured. We felt that committees were supposed to be acting free from pressure, and this was not the case. Another thing, it seemed to me, was the fact that the opposition said that the conference was very much more in their favor than in the candidate presented by the board. But wherever we talked to people, we found that the claims of the opposition were exaggerated, and I think that this is borne out in the actual voting, that the negative vote was very slight.
Yes. Unfortunately, we don't have complete minutes on the convention. There is in Folkebladet a fuller account than in the annual report. You know, the annual report has got a daily journal. And this journal indicates that the report of committee number 2 was considered on Friday afternoon. The first paragraphs were adopted pretty much without discussion. They were non-controversial. And then, of course, when they got to the presidency, a substitute motion was introduced on the floor. Maybe that was the substitute motion that you were asked to submit as a minority report. Professor H.N. Hendrickson be retained as acting president for 1 year, and Dr. B.M. Christensen be made dean of the college department, and Dr. Sverdrup Norberg dean of the theological department. Now, that was presented by John Quanbeck, Pastor John Quanbeck of Starbuck, according to this. And before the discussion got underway, the secretary read a letter from Dr. Sverdrup Norberg in which he stated that he had decided to refuse nomination to the office of president of Augsburg Seminary. 11 speakers took part in the discussion of the substitute motion, 6 for and 5 against. And so this got to be pretty long. The Folkebladet account indicates that it got to be so long that quite a few of the delegates left. Do you remember that?
No, I can't say that I remember that. A substitute motion of this nature, of course, would be handled completely by the conference president, and the secretary would be either standing or sitting off to one side. Mm-hmm. And as the time passed, I can well imagine that many of the delegates did leave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, then to just to proceed here, just to refresh your memory on this. Then a motion was made. I mean, after that long discussion on the substitute motion, then a motion was made that paragraph 4, which dealt with Dr. Sverdrup Norberg's nomination for permanent professorship in Old Testament theology, be voted on before discussion of the substitute motion. And this motion was adopted, you see, so they discussed Norberg as a theological professor. and the paragraph was adopted. That is, he was approved by the conference as theological professor. And just to follow that up a little bit, there were negotiations through the summer that were directed apparently towards securing his acceptance, but of course he did not accept. Then, a motion was then entertained to table the substitute motion. The substitute motion, you know, that Professor Hendrickson should act for 1 more year. Now this was to table it. And the result of this voting was 146 for and 79 against. You know, the 146 for would have been against the motion.
Yes.
And the 79 against would have been for it. So that put the original paragraph 3, that is, the nomination of Christensen, before the House. 5 speakers discussed the paragraph, 4 being in favor and 1 against. Pastor Arnold Helseth moved at the meeting vote on the question whether the election of the president of Augsburg shall be decided this year or delayed until next year. Professor Hendrickson was opposed to a year's delay and urged the conference to settle the matter. A motion to table Helseth's motion was entertained, and this motion was adopted with 138 votes for and 57 against. And then they sang a hymn, and they had a season of prayer for the guidance of God's Spirit in this more important matter. And after that, the meeting proceeded to vote by ballot on the original paragraph 3. And the result here, Christensen's nomination, was approved by 214 affirmative ballots, 70 negative, 13 ballots marked not voting, and 3 ballots marked Dr. Norberg. That's the way it's summarized here.
I can remember the fact that in the meeting there were these large numbers because so often in our Lutheran Free Church conferences the balloting became rather lax, and to have votes of over 200 were quite unusual. And of course, as I mentioned before, Dr. Berntwood was an admirable chairman of a church conference, because these interruptions for the singing of a hymn and followed by a prayer session were very effective in subduing rather boisterous spirits, including the secretary, I presume.
Yeah. Well, now, I'd like to ask you another question here. Do you think that these votes, now they're not all of them consistent, but you have one vote here, 146 really for the board's position, 79 against, 138 for, 57 against, and then of course 214 for original paragraph 3, 70 against. That is, you'd have to say there were 86 against, 214 to 86 if you count the Norberg vote, the not voting vote, and the negative vote. Do you think that reflected the sense of the convention, or do you think the Norberg people were closer to being correct in saying that they had considerable support?
Well, actually, I would have no way of knowing it in detail, but I would think that the vote pretty well reflects the spirit of the meeting. I think that the leaders of the opposition were very popular and were very energetic, and had certainly had many button-holding sessions with voting delegates, so that they tried to raise their total vote to as much as they possibly could. So I think that, and of course the opposition didn't work at all as far as I know. So I think that the vote then would represent about as much as the minority could possibly have raised under any circumstances. And some of it, of course, would have been artificially encouraged, the people voting really in harmony with their friends rather than for any conviction that they might have had. So I think that I think that the opposition was really pretty much of a scarehead rather than an actual active opposition.
Now, I have one more question about the opposition. It's not entirely clear from the sources that I have here. And that is its composition. Now, it's pretty clear that this young group, you might call it almost a children's crusade. Well, that group of collegians and seminarians with John Stensvag and Abner Batalden in the lead, they were one important element in it, weren't they? And who else was in it? Was it a coalition between them and some other groups? Do you remember, were there any of the older people who were suspicious of cooperation with the American Lutheran Conference? Did they tend to rally to the Norberg candidacy? There's some indication that this might be so from the letters coming into Folkebladet.
I wouldn't have any insight on that at all, I think. I was surprised to discover that Cy Melby was a member of the opposition. But, of course, he was concerned about the evangelistic awakening, which I think he envisioned with dynamic personages Norberg was. And it seems to me that this is probably one of the things that stirred the emotions and imaginations of the others, too, in the minority group. But I really couldn't say. It seems to me that it would be fair to say that it was represented a cross-section of enthusiasts, both for the vision of building new buildings and for expanding the influence of Augsburg throughout the Lutheran Free Church and simply getting a new dynamic in motion. I really don't know of too terribly many persons involved other than the leaders themselves with whom I had some contact during the conference.
Gerda?
I think you're right in talking about some of these people who were a little bit afraid that Christensen was going to lead them into merger with other groups. And so some of those ultra-conservatives voted against this because I think they had a feeling that if Norberg was elected, he would certainly keep us just the Lutheran Free Church and not so much the movement for the others. But I think that I know every annual conference it seemed that there was some big issue that took a day or a day and a half, and it seemed that this got to be a therapy for the whole group. And I had a feeling at the end of that day that somehow there came a pause enough for people to do some second thinking before that final vote was cast, and it was pretty representative.
Now, Berner, you mentioned Melby. Was he active in the convention on behalf of Norberg?
I don't think that he was active in any sense other than that he was along with the leaders of the supporters of Norberg. I don't remember talking to him in person, except that I remember when Batalden talked to me, then Melby was right beside him and was seconding his statements. This had reference to, as I recall it, introducing a substitute motion or turning in at least a minority report. I don't know why the minority report should have not appealed to them in particularly, but it seemed to me that was a kind of a second choice. Perhaps minority reports are not too effective in a conference. There's something negative about it at the very beginning. But Melby, of course, was a Bible teacher, and he had heard enough of Norberg to regard him as an outstanding Bible teacher, so he had a great deal of enthusiasm for him. And as I mentioned before, the wave of enthusiasm that came as a result of Norberg's dynamic leadership in reference to raising funds for creating Memorial Hall, was enough to sell many of the young people on his fitness as a leader of the institution itself.
Do you have something to add? In the Norberg vocal claque. Yeah, and who were the leaders? Was Betalden and Stensvåg? Am I right? Was John there? John Stensvåg?
I don't remember. I don't remember particularly Stensvåg, but the person that I talked to most of all was Betalden, because of course we were college classmates, and I think he had a sense of control. Mm-hmm. He had always been able to dominate me during college days, and so he assumed that same control later as well.
Do you remember John Quanbeck here? I've asked Phil about this. He doesn't remember anything about it. Now, he was the one that introduced the substitute motion. Did he play a role here?
I don't remember this particular conference. John Quanbeck, of course, came to Augsburg Seminary late in life. As I recall it, he was a new theological student the year I was a senior, and he distinguished himself by being a very aggressive basketball player, particularly, and became quite a leader for the younger group because he was aggressive, both and vocal, and of course had some more experience, and he was more mature than most of them. So, I can say that I think that he was too energetic, both on the basketball field and in his activities among the students, as far as his aggressiveness was concerned. As the chairman of the student council for a year, or the student society we used to call it in those days, I had many clashes with a number of seminary students, including John Quanbeck.
Well,
recollections are not too
yeah.
sweet at that point.
I think probably we've gone as far as we need go on this particular topic. I think there was something quite different that we wanted to ask you about here too. Just one more question now. 30 years after the event, it's of course very easy to see things that were not present then. And it occurs to me when I look at some of this that in some sense this contest presaged or anticipated the later battle over merger. Would that be correct? Do you think that you see the faint outlines of that here? I think we really touched on that. Or were these other questions, the dynamism of Norberg and the idea that he would get a campus built and give that kind of leadership, was that the predominant thing?
I don't think I would be qualified to answer that because I haven't given any thought to it. It seems to me, though, that the leaders of the opposition 30 years ago later became the leaders for the merger.
Well, that's true, of course.
And this would be somewhat inconsistent with the general pattern. Now, of course, that there could be this energetic group within the church that didn't always see the ideas of the mainstream. This is entirely possible, but I don't personally see any trend there beginning at that particular time.
Yeah.
But you remember, too, that John Stensvåg, for a long time, was anti-merger. And it wasn't until we had gotten well into the discussion whether we should have merger or not, that John was thoroughly converted to become for the merger of the church. I remember that annual meeting in Wilmer, I guess it was, when he finally said, well, I've changed my mind.
Well, this I think is true, but isolated cases, you find when you have very strong personalities that they tend to swing from one extreme to the other. It seemed a little inconsistent that he should be the interpreter of Sverdrup, as he did at that Wilmer conference, and then at the same time just lately resigned from the leader of the opposition of the merger. So there is a little inconsistency there, but it seems to me that there was a struggle for leadership there, more so than there was a struggle for, I should say, personal leadership, or an attempt to gain a position of power rather than having the leadership of the church as such.
Well, I think this concludes our discussion of the 38 conference then. And now maybe we can stop it just a little. Berner, during your early years here as dean, you came in 41, you were here in 41, 42, and then you returned in
October in 40.
I returned in October in 45.
October in 45. Mm-hmm.
Well, I may say that as far as my employment is concerned, there are many people who have said to me, I hope half humorously, that, oh, I see you were hired because you were the one that put the president into nomination in 1938. And I think this is not true, because my first conference with President Christensen about coming to Augsburg as really as Dean of Men and Counselor of Boys, this is the thing that he was most concerned about, I suppose came during 1940. I had a letter from him in which he asked if I would stop in sometime when I was in the city, and we would have lunch together, which was a very characteristic Christensen procedure. We did have lunch together, and we had 2 or 3 other sessions in which he discussed Augsburg as an institution. He even mentioned the fact that he had decided to discuss the possibility of having a dean of the college, and he wanted to know what my opinion was about certain people in that area. At first I was disturbed to think that I was being promoted for something for which I had no qualifications, but this score was settled very quickly when he mentioned the persons that he had in mind. But I did come to Augsburg with a contract which stated that I was to be in charge of the boys, to serve as counselor and dean of men, and incidentally teach speech and freshman English. So I had, from the very start, 2 full-time jobs. But let me say that he wasn't satisfied to let things wait till he got the personnel for it, because as I recall it, Gerda Mortensen and as Dean of Women, and Erling Erdahl as an interested teacher, I suppose, had begun the student personnel work at least 2 years before, or maybe 3, so that when I came there was a going concern. They had a department of student personnel, and all I did was to fit into it. And of course the fact that I stayed there only 1 year from the beginning was not of very much help to anyone except me. I learned a lot that year. The position of Dean of Men was not exactly an easy one during that year, because Cy Melby was still living in his old quarters, and to all intents and purposes he was still the dean, and a younger man with no dynamics to to boast of. I wasn't a popular basketball coach. In fact, I don't know of anything that I had to offer, except that I did insist on getting new furniture for my office, which was in Memorial Hall, and this was finally granted, even though I bought it myself. And incidentally, I still own the desk. But those were times when Augsburg didn't have as much money as it has had both before and after.
Now that work that Ms. Mortensen and Erling Erdahl did on student personnel, was that done before your first stint of service here, or was it done in the interim between your first stint and your coming back?
No, the work had begun. I don't remember when they first started attending these North Central summer sessions, but they had attended at least one before I came. And these North Central workshops, which were held either at University of Minnesota or at the University of Illinois, were geared towards helping different institutions develop their own personal program, and of course the program that was prominent at Augsburg was that of a student personnel program. It envisioned student counseling for freshmen, assistance at registration time, vocational guidance, and I think all the general areas of student personnel as we know it today. And while it was held as in a kind of suspended state, I suppose, for 3 years, my place was taken over by Erling Tungseth, who was then a senior in the seminary. I should say he lived in the dormitory as head resident during the first year, and really I'm not familiar with what happened because by that time I had gone overseas, and I didn't know much about it until October 45.
Gerda, do you have some comments?
We had started this talk quite early, even before you came, as you had indicated, and Erling Erdahl had been one of the first people to spend a summer at this workshop. I had been with Dr. Christensen the summer before when they first initiated them, had invited me to come along in. So he said, well, now we can get some ideas. And so at national conventions, I had made a study, and we started the university student personnel workshops, institutes in the fall, and got ideas from there. And then the summer of 45, I had been the representative to the workshop, and Dr. Christensen had asked me, just take student activities. And it was when we were getting ready to plan this science building. And when I got over there, Dr. Gilbert Wren was just back from service, and he had heading up this whole work of student personnel at Minnesota, and Doug, what was his name? Dugan, Dr. Willis Dugan. The two of them are a great team. And so it was Wren that I chose as my leader in that particular workshop, and I told Dr. Christensen, we have to take a look at the total student personnel program. And so the total student personnel program is one of the things that we started to study, and then I asked if we couldn't both, Mr. Dahlen and I, be representatives at the workshop the following summer, which we did. And after that, we both took courses from Dr. Wren. No, we were in that administration course, weren't we, together? On the, administering student personnel, so that we got a chance to work on the floor plan of the first floor of this building in order to try to put our offices in such a way that we'd be adjacent to the registrar's office and to some of the others, so that we tried to work out even in that capacity some of these things. And when you came back from the service, weren't you appointed Dean of Students at that point with a broader point of supervising this total program? And together we worked, and I was made coordinator of student activities, and so together we tried to work as best we could to implement And mind you, I had a full load too. Berner Dahlen had, full teaching load and full the other. And I had all the supervision of the housing of women, and we didn't have a dormitory for them. And I had to hunt for houses in every area from Cedar to Riverside to the river to Franklin Avenue in order to house people. All these things just simply were done, but we tried to do the best we could under what we had. We developed many of the areas, but the beginnings were there. And we worked at trying to implement them and make them as workable as possible.
You would trace the beginnings then really to the early years of Christensen's administration.
Yes.
There were before the war,
Yes.
and then what happened after the war was, in a sense, further development
Yes.
or fruition of it.
Well, I'm quite sure that he mentioned when I was hired, when the arrangements were being made for me to come to Augsburg, he mentioned the fact that this work was going on, and that there was a plan proceeding under which students would be taken care of through student personnel work. And the particular reason he chose me was that I'd had 5 years of successful Boy Scout work and some community dramatics in my teaching up at Crosby Ironton. I was a director of plays for the high school, which extended into junior high school and some community activity, so that by putting those two things together, he thought he had someone who might have some insight into student personnel interests and activities. And so I'm quite sure that this is what he had in mind when he hired me, was that student personnel program was already in effect. And then, of course, as Gerda mentioned, the workshops that we attended at the university, I attended 2. I guess you probably attended 3, 4. And I know that Erling Erdahl had attended at least 1 before I came, so we certainly would have to mention that the North Central Association gave us of their best. And at these workshops, we studied ideal programs, and in some of our coursework, we were given assignments. I went once to St. Olaf College and investigated their student personnel program, which at that time, I may say, was not very much of a program. And my experience has been, as a member of the American College Personnel Association, of the National Vocational Guidance Association, that Augsburg has been quite far in advance of most of the schools in our area in programs, both in the handling of student affairs and of handling of student registration, of counseling, of vocational guidance, and so on. And it sometimes amuses me to hear students in our day, particularly those who want to test the faculty courses, and I've even forgotten the term that I'm supposed to be thinking
Student
of.
evaluation of
Student evaluation of teachers. I even had to do one of these during one of the workshop sessions, must be about 20 years ago, when I worked with one of the sisters from St. Scholastica in Duluth, and we designed our own, which was extensively used throughout the United States. I remember getting requests from both South and East from different colleges who asked permission to use our form. But this, of course, simply indicates the characteristic of human beings, that we're not very good historians. We have a very short memory. We see the thing that's current and have no memory for the past.
I certainly agree with that. I could give many instances, I think, in other areas. Now, just shifting a little bit, it must have been quite a challenge, and maybe both you and Miss Mortensen would want to comment on this too. It must have been quite a challenge to face that post-war crop when enrollment just bulged in, well, I suppose in 46, 47, there was some bulge in late 45, 46 even. Do you have any comments on that?
I don't remember when Art Nash was registrar. Was that in 41, 42? He was acting registrar for 1 year, and during the summer we met. And he asked if the student personnel services could help in registering students for the fall. And I think that this is the first time that we really got our program of student orientation underway. And this experience was invaluable when in 1945, in 46 really, we got one new class that started at the second semester. And then we began one in the middle of the semester. So we had 3 classes going. And then we started one unusual one about the 15th of March. We had a short session with double periods and a limited number of credits. So we really had 4 separate classes going all in one year. And then, of course, we had the summer session. But I may say, before I turn this over to Gerda, that as far as the men were concerned, coming back from the service, they were an ideal group of persons to deal with. They had no clothing. Their money was all provided for them through the GI Bill. So they presented no problem of any kind. They simply got their books from the bookstores and studied their lessons. They had a pair of trousers, civilian trousers, and a sweater or 2 and a jacket, and that provided their whole wardrobe. In contrast to now, of course, with the rainbow colors, both top and bottom, and all the other things that go with it, stereo and hi-fi, it becomes not only a problem of control, but of logistics. Where are you going to put all of the things?
I recall one meeting I was asked to represent Augsburg at a meeting of all the Minnesota private college councils and all the people who are heads of education. And they just announced at that meeting that we have a certain number of thousand students that have to be taken care of this year. And Augsburg's portion is 200. And will you just take them? Well, everybody said, yes, we will just take them. We don't know where we're going to put them, what we're going to do. But that group of post-war veterans who came that had no connection with us, they just simply came here to classes and went again, and really didn't enter into the life of the college at all. But I remember that group of fellows who came back and how much fun it was in history class, because, all right, I want to write about Russian diplomatic relations because they'd been held by the Russians, or I want to do something on Italy because I was in Italy, or I want to write on the Negroes because I was in the South. And then that group of men who found that their dear coach, Simon Alby, had died, they dedicated the year to winning basketball, so the cream of the crop of 6 different years formed a basketball team, and they won the state championship, which gave a kind of a forward-moving and it was a great cohesive force and a real fun type of thing. But they also were, like you said, very ready to settle down and get educated and get out and to do some of the things. Glad to be back again. And I think, too, that our working toward accreditation within our Central Association, Dr. Christensen very early was smart enough to, I remember said, well, why can't we just expect our teachers to be back the 1st of September? The university does. They don't start school till the fall, but they're expected to be in the offices then. Why don't we try some faculty workshops? And so he was willing to do this. And I remember Dr. Ruth C. Eckert, who some of us have taken courses from at the university, came over and one workshop one fall, said, well, now I've given you my whole course in higher education in the United States and many other things. And we had Dr. Wren, we had Dr. Dugan, we had some of these people come to help us and to orient the whole faculty toward this. And I would say, too, that the faculty was very willing to accept the assignments that you made, Berner, when we talked about having counselors and working out the beginnings of this program. And I know we worked out one of these outlines, which we used for many years to get information about the students. And Dr. Wren used that as one of the examples in his book on personnel, which he and Ruth Strang got out that year following our being at that orientation or organization administration of personnel work at Minnesota. But they kept up their personal interest in us and kept sending their students over to visit us, just as we had been sent out to visit other institutions.
Well, I just want to mention, as far as some of these programs are concerned, we, of course, did have the advice from the best people in the business. Dr. Wren was president of the American College Personnel Association, simultaneously with being president of the National Vocational Guidance Association. So it was fortunate for him that they met in convention at the same time, so he could give his presidential address only once. And the information that they gave us, of course, was enough to give us the ideas that formulated the program, which we followed. For example, Gerda mentioned the faculty being counselors. Now, the University of Minnesota program insisted on having professional counselors do all the counseling. And if you had a registration advisor, this was fine, but to try nothing else. Now, in the national picture, there came a movement. One of the directors of the national, he was a member of the Washington staff of the National Education Association, indicated that because of the great need for counseling, no group of professionals could possibly cover it. It was necessary to introduce the idea of faculty counselors, and so it was necessary to have in-service training. So we began in-service training, and I remember our faculty very well grumbling somewhat, but still accepting their responsibilities and doing an admirable job. I think anytime we went to a professional conference, such as the ACE, American College Personnel Association, or the NVGA at Chicago or elsewhere, we were always proud to think that we've already been doing this program at Augsburg for a year or 2 or 5, so it is nothing new to us, and we can report on our success rather than look forward to doing something in that area.
Yeah, well, it's very good to get this information on tape. Now, getting back to this post-war crop of students, do you think that over the long range that this crop did contribute to make our student community more heterogeneous, less homogeneous than it had been before?
Yes, I'm sure of this, that our student group became much more heterogeneous, but I would say that I would support it 100% if there was a chance for politics to be involved in scholarship programs. The GI Bill that we had after World War II was certainly the finest program that could be introduced, where the student was given the tuition. Well, the tuition money was paid to the institution after he had chosen the institution, but he was given his subsistence, and he could choose any school that he wanted. And I think of a number of teachers in Minneapolis public schools, for example, both elementary and high school, who graduated from Augsburg during those years, who had no connection at all with our institution. My own children went through Bancroft School for Mr. Capitz, who went here. He was a student of mine in the short story during the summer session, I remember. And he lives in South Minneapolis. We've seen him and his wife in operation. And he had absolutely no connection with Augsburg under the faint, remotest circumstances. And yet he is one of the most eager readers of the morning paper to see how Augsburg did the night before, or he looks to see what programs are coming. And I think he's typical of the